So if they're thinking about starting some kind of social housing, so probably pair housing is best to start.
Well, welcome back, everyone, to the Dairy Science Digest. This is a podcast designed to bring the Journal of Dairy Science straight to the ears of dairy producers. My name is Reagan Bluel, and I'm from the University of Missouri Dairy Team. And today we have a well-traveled guest from Iowa State University, Dr. Katarina Buckova. And during her stint in Iowa, she and two other researchers prepared an invited review for the Journal of Dairy Science titled A Systemic Review of the Effects of Paired Housing on Dairy calf welfare and productivity. And the goal of these reviews is to comb through all of the published science surrounding a topic, to compare the results and then summarize the overall outcomes. Dairy science introduced individual hutches way back in the early 40s, and it's pretty well been the gold standard for calf care during that pre-weaning phase. However, with potential policy shifts and interests in consumer requests, we're seeking more information about the science and the possibility of group housing and how that might affect our herd success. So thank you for joining us today all the way from Taiwan. Welcome, and would you please take a moment to just introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much for this invitation. Hello, everyone. So my name is Katarina Buckova. I was previously based at Iowa State. Right now I am in Taiwan. My research topic is how to improve welfare of farm animals, especially dairy and pigs. I'm also interested how to measure emotional states in animals, mostly in farm animals. And when it comes to dairy, my most important or favorite topic is how to house cows in alternative housing systems, for example, pair housing.
Fantastic. And so as I was reading through this is a very comprehensive study, guys, and I assure you that you'll find a link to this paper in the show notes below. And there were several tables summarizing all of these overarching themes, but they really kind of narrowed into, if I would be so bold to summarize them, into performance, health, and then the interaction of the calf. Within each of those topics, there's individual subtopics that impact the baby calf. And so I think before we get into all of those breakdowns, I just wanted you to talk to me a little bit about what stimulated you to delve into this particular topic.
So one of my research topic is how to house dairy calves socially, especially in pairs. And I got to this topic during my PhD study at Czech University of Life Sciences in Prague. So basically my whole PhD project was about pair housing of dairy cows. So we were assessing different variables of calf welfare, for example, performance, health, stress resiliency, behavior, emotional states. And I got very interested in the topic. And I also noticed that there were many studies on the topic, but there was no review, particularly on pair housing. So I felt like it would be very beneficial for scientists, but also for producers to actually summarize all these research papers.
Yeah, and I was actually pretty intrigued as I was coming through the article that the first real study of this topic was way back in '02, right? And so again, guys, to summarize the goal of this invited review, her and her team summarized a total of 48 different articles in the literature over a span of about 25 years. And so as you were combing through that, I want to first talk about some general themes over the broader topics of 48 papers. What was the span of time that most of the researchers chose to integrate the paired housing? Like at what day of production did those calves meet their neighbor?
Yeah, so a majority of studies was focused on really young dairy calves, so until they are weaned from milk. but there were also a few studies after weaning. So they were looking at how cows were doing after they were introduced to groups. And what we found, and it's interesting, but we would really allow to see more research here, is that there were only limited number of studies on more long-term measurements. So basically, there were really just few studies looking at how individually or per house dairy cows are doing when they are adult. So this is what I think would be really beneficial for producers and also interesting for science or research itself.
You bet. I did think that that was one of the bigger take homes that I had after reading the papers. I want to know, how does the impact of pairing them together affect them long term? What does that look like in the mature cow? Does it impact her longevity and overall productivity? And let's dive right into performance. And again, as you were stating, this is going to be primarily the pre-weaned phase, and calves in general were commingled about, what do you say, two to 3 days of life? Is that common, or did they mostly get commingled right away?
Oh, it differed, right? So sometimes researchers really introduced them to pairs almost after birth, but sometimes they took few days and sometimes even 1 or 2 weeks. So this was really a difference.
And so after they were paired together, there were some behavioral responses observed across the papers, and then there were also performance-based observations. So in summary, what are some of the health or performance observations that some of the researchers were documenting?
The majority of papers, they didn't report differences between individual and pair house cows in performance or health. So I think this is quite important for dairy producers to hear, because sometimes I'm hearing opinions. They are actually worried that if they house cows together, even if with only one conspecific, it could mean their body weight and health will be impaired. But in our review, we cannot confirm this. So they will gain in similar way, and also they will not be different when it comes to health. When we are talking about health, so there weren't too many studies. So we need to be a little bit cautious here. But when it comes to performance, so especially body weight gain, we found almost 30 studies, and we can make quite a strong conclusion on this. And I would like to know that some studies also found improved body weight gain in pair house cows compared to individually housed cows, but a majority, there was no difference, right? So we need to interpret the overall picture. I just want to note that under certain circumstances, pair house cows are more likely to gain more than less. So I don't think we found any single study where pair house cows would actually gain less compared to individually housed cows. But we found several studies where pair house cows gained more. So under certain circumstances, for example, if they get higher amounts of milk, so there can be benefits on their body weight. But in general, we have to say they are not any different from individually housed cows.
Sure. And I think it's kind of fun to look at, spoiler alert, guys, if you flip near the back, table 11 has summarized all of these different topics. It's a very comprehensive review. I want to say just shy of 20 pages, but table 11 really is the brass tacks of what's going on. And you can quickly see right off the bat that this nutritional side of the topic is the most broadly researched. Out of 48 studies, there's 21 that look at solid feed intake, 26 looking at growth. And so it is the most studied topic of the paired housing. And I think when I interview producers that have paired housing, that's something that they always comment on, that the calves just tend to they encourage each other, I guess is maybe the best word that I can think of for that. It's almost as if they push the other animal or remind the other animal that they need to be coming and looking at that grain and tasting the grain and eating the grain, and as a result, anytime you have improved dry matter intake, you're going to find growth. And the question that often comes up is volume of milk. And we understand that as dairymen, we see the behavior of calves. And so if you are feeding a certain volume, there's definitely going to be an impact on behavior after feeding. So can you talk through, of the 48 studies, what was a reoccurring theme as total liters of milk per calf per day?
There were few studies and they fed calves ad libitum, right? They basically could get as much milk as they wanted, but this wasn't very common. So there were just few studies like that. And if I exclude these studies, there were several studies and they fed calves around 10 kilograms per day. So it was quite nice, but and the minimum I would say they were really feeding as per farm practice. It would be 5 kilograms per day.
For those of you that are hurriedly doing the calculations, 10 kilograms of milk times 2.2 is 22 pounds of milk. And then you divide that by the 8.6, and pretty quickly you get to the 2.5 gallons of milk per day. And so that's quite the aggressive growth. What kind of intake of dry matter grain were you seeing on average for the 48 projects?
What was interesting that almost nobody calculated feed conversion ratio. So even if they had data on body weight and feed intake, so they almost never calculated feed conversion ratio. And I think it's very important for producers, right? So this is something what we should improve in our research.
Sure. What I'm hearing in a reoccurring response is that the important effect of this summary is a recognition of how we as researchers need to make sure that we are reflecting the needs of dairy farmers when we're conducting this science and ensuring that we're capturing the impact to producers, both on the short and long term. Looking at health effects with that volume of intake, did you see scours across the studies?
Yes, but in almost any study, there was no difference between pair house and individually housed cows, right? But I have to say we didn't have too many studies on health, and the other issue was we need more robust health measurements. So often, calf health was actually assessed based on observation. Okay, so is there any scarring or coughing? So it was basically just done like a binary outcome, no or yes. But this is not very robust, and also sometimes there were missing definitions. So, okay, so how did you actually define, let's say, sneezing or coughing, right? So we
Right.
definitely need more studies on health of pair versus individually housed cows.
I was really surprised that only 10
Mm.
out of that big long list, only 10 of them was really looking at health. And like you were saying, yeah, just not really quantifying it, because again, as I interview dairymen about this particular topic as it emerges, that's some of their biggest concerns. Looking at navel concerns and having the calves cross sucking, or what are the implications on udder development and maybe ear infections
Yes.
or the transfer of disease. Can you speak towards maybe some of the negative outcomes that are a possible concern?
Yes, I definitely agree with what you just said, that it's very important, right? Well, because it's I'm hearing the same, right? So if I sometimes speak to dairy producers, they often share this as one reason why not doing social housing, because they're concerned about
Yeah.
increased transfer of pathogens, and it's reasonable, right? Because it is like fair concern, I would say. But on the other hand, very often individual pens are really close to each other.
Mhm.
So cows can still touch and lick each other. So the question is like, how isolated they actually are, right? So
Right.
maybe it's not so big difference if they are two cows together or if two cows can reach each other through the fence. So
Well, and I guess as I was reading through, it just seemed like there were several parameters that were investigated that just had no effect. And that can be looked at two different ways. You can say,
mm,
well, there's really nothing bad about individual housing in the grand scheme of things, but there's actually probably nothing good about paired housing, and so
mm,
um, as I was reading through this, yes, you might get accelerated rate of gains, but without understanding the long-term cost of those accelerated gains, it left me scratching my head a little. And I'm delicate around this topic because I certainly don't want to do anything that alienates our consumer base
mm.
from consuming our delicious, delightful, nutritious product. But at the same token, I want science to be able to profoundly declare that dairymen are doing right. They're doing well with the development of their calves. And I think as I was reading your paper, it is well studied. And what we've learned is that both work, right?
Yes, so I agree with you. Like, okay, so maybe producers can ask, so okay, if there is no difference in these parameters between individual and pair house cows, so why I should start doing that? But there are some other differences in relation to calf behavior.
Yeah. Let's get into the discussion on the effect of paired housing on human and calf interactions, and specifically around stressful husbandry practices. So what were some of the observations that the articles that you were reviewing had on these husbandry practices that maybe challenge the calf?
The most interesting finding of this review was that pair house cows seem to cope better with stressful husbandry procedures, for example, disbudding, weaning, or taking blood. So I think this is quite important finding, especially for dairy calf welfare, and interesting to dig into why, and it can be probably because of social buffering effect. And this means that if two familiar conspecifics are housed together and they experience some stress, they can recover more quickly from the stress. And it is because they are cues such as touches or vocal communication, and they impact stress response. It is very interesting.
It is quite curious to think about the mode of action that could be doing this, and even without paired housing, I recall when I was milking their calves that would commingle together in what I call calf kindergarten. They seem to just cling to each other throughout the entire phase of production. 441 and 444 would always be together. They would show heat together, and then they would get pregnant together, and then they would give birth together, and spend that time in the dry cow pen together after they got bred again. And so it's just interesting to watch those behaviors. And I'm sure listeners here have experienced that same thing. They've seen their calves develop as cows through the cycle. And it is curious to wonder what is the physiological effect of that interaction that they might be having together.
Hmm. It was from physiological perspective, no. So there were mostly studies based on behavior, right? So for example, they looked on vocalization after weaning from milk in pair versus individually housed cows, and they found that pair housed cows reduced vocalization after weaning compared to individually housed cows. So it was still based on behavior. I don't think actually there was any physiological study which could be actually interesting, let's say, for example, to see if wounds after disbudding can heal more quickly in pair house cows. So it would be really
Yeah.
good idea for future research.
Yeah, it would. That would be hugely helpful to understand. Yes. As we're talking here, if I have researchers listening in, what would be your recommendation after reviewing all of these articles when they're creating a project? What would the perfect research project on this topic look like?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So definitely it should include evaluating some longer term effects because it would have larger implications. Yeah, definitely we need more robust measurements of health. And I also think some variables were simply neglected. I already mentioned feed conversion ratio, but there were others, for example, abnormal behaviors, like cross-sucking. This is a very important behavior when it comes to dairy calf welfare. Producers are concerned about increased cross-sucking in their calves if they are housed in pairs early in their life, but there were only few studies actually looking at cross-sucking in older cows, right?
Right. Very good. Okay, and so that was speaking to the researchers, but what about to the dairy producers listening in? What was the most impactful thing that you drew out of this summary review?
Yes, first of all, I would just say that they shouldn't be concerned about pair house cows gaining less compared to individually housed cows. So more likely there will be either no difference or pair house cows will gain more. So they shouldn't be really worried about body weight gain. So if they're thinking about starting some kind of social housing, so probably pair housing is best to start because there are not so many things to adjust compared, for example, if you want to do group housing of 20 cows, right? So this is something really different. And dairy cows are really socially motivated, as demonstrated by the reduced response to stressful husbandry procedures. There was actually some similar finding, and it was that pair house cows seem to have better developed social behavior. So they are able to read other cows better because they learn it when they were housed in pairs later in their life, right? So this can help them to cope better later in life when they are introduced to groups after weaning from milk. So you are going to help your calves a little bit, but you are not going to lose so much because there are not really any high investments in relation connected to pair housing, right? So you really don't have to rebuild your whole barn or anything.
Good. That's a good summary as guys are looking at ways to reinvest into their operation, determining that maybe this is not the best way to reinvest. If you have your hutches in place and your system established, maybe this is not the right place.
Yes, you just need to merge two hatches together, and actually, I think you can already buy hatch for pair house cows. So this is the only adjustment they need to do, right?
Very good. Well, I guess just in your professional opinion, you brought up something about grouping 20 calves together versus paired. I know that wasn't summarized in this review, but is there benefit to the group over the pairs if someone was trying to choose, if they were planning on building a calf barn right now and reading the consumer demands, recognizing that perhaps grouped housing or paired housing might be necessary, what would you recommend to those producers that are trying to build a barn today?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So there are different risks and different advantages associated with pair housing as well as group housing. So for example, if you house your cows in pairs, so you are less likely to cope with some impaired health, right? Because there are just two cows. In comparison, if you have 20 cows together, so you are more likely that your cows will get something. So disease transfer will be a little bit higher, right? So this is logical, but disadvantage of pair housing may be that they are not getting enough social contact because naturally they would be in more complex social environment. So they would be in herd. We know that there are adult animals. There are also several cows. So rarely calf would be just with one individual, right? So if they are in groups with more animals, so probably they learn social behavior better because they have more other cows to interact with. And the other thing to think about is that now we are trying to incorporate automatic systems everywhere, right?
Mm-hmm.
So often we want to feed them from automatic feeders, and this is something what you cannot do in pair housing. If you have increased incidence of certain diseases, but still you would like to switch to some alternative housing systems in dairy cows, so don't go for big groups, so just do pairs. Or for
Yes.
example, if you have a high disease incidence on the farm, so maybe don't do it. So just
Yeah.
do something with your diseases and then do it. Yeah.
I think the conversation matters around that, and helping producers understand how to navigate this and make the right choices. Some of my concerns as I hear discussions about the change in the next Farmers Assuring Responsible Management or the Farm 6.0, I know there's been some discussion about mandatory paired housing.
Mm.
And my biggest concern with that is the infrastructure costs associated with mandating that. And if we can't have science
Mm.
that truly backs the need for that, every iteration of farm programs have done up to this point has really helped embrace best management practices,
Mm.
right? Those little baby calves need water. And so that it's required for them to have water under the Farm 5.0. And I feel like that's okay, but should they, do they really need to be paired housed? If not, then should we really require producers in such tight margins to mandate them to co-house,
Yeah, well, I agree that they
Um,
should be given like sufficient time, to switch. So I agree with that, but I also think, based on literature, that they are really strongly socially motivated, right? Because we have a social species, and cattle, they are also social.
mhm,
And there has been research on that, like showing they are actually willing to do work to get a contact with conspecific. So for them,
sure.
I think is very important. But of course, when the farm has like important issues with disease management or something like that, so maybe not yet. Yeah. But,
Right. Yes.
uh,
Right. It can be a challenge. And I guess we need to document that those
mm,
options are out there, and so that those that don't have disease issues
mm,
and that have effectively figured out the calf side of things and are willing to feed 2.5 gallons of milk a day, then maybe it is a best practice. And it's so hard to quantify the long-term impact, but that has got to happen. Some of the most exciting science that I review on this podcast are when researchers have taken the time to really look at the
mm,
implications from calf all the way through not only first lactation, but maybe several lactations. I think this has been an interesting discussion,
yeah.
and what I'm taking from all of it is that we still just don't know. And I really genuinely believe in my heart of hearts that dairy farm families are doing the best that they possibly can to rear these animals as safely and humanely as possible, and integrating them back into their herding instinct that is so profound as quickly as they can. And while a valiant effort to study and research what consumers desire, it just the data's not there yet to definitively say that we need to be doing this
Yes,
differently. Do
although it
you?
was quite surprising, like I expected, if we found 48 studies, so for sure we will be able to draw strong conclusions, but finally,
Right.
not really. And what about other
Yeah.
topics?
And
Social housing in dairy cows is quite well explored, but we have some other welfare related topics, and they are even less explored, and there are all these discussions, maybe
yeah.
we should force something, you know.
Mm,
So,
it's just too soon.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good. Well, this has been very informative, a great discussion, and thank you so much for your time and willingness to share your science with our audience to help folks best understand the possible implications of co-housing their pre-weaned calves. Listeners, I applaud you for taking time out of your day today to keep abreast on this emerging topic. I've really learned a lot from our conversation, and this has been the October edition of the Dairy Science Digest, a monthly podcast project designed to bring the Journal of Dairy Science straight to your ears. We highlight peer-reviewed research articles in press so you can use sound science to base your management decisions around. And this is provided to you by your University of Missouri Dairy team. So please be sure to like, share, and subscribe to get future editions straight to your cell phone. This is Reagan Bluel with the Dairy Science Digest, and I hope you have a great day.